Well, the speaker who's going to land this plane, bring us home, he's just the guy to do it. Kai Nilsen, since 2005, has served as a lead pastor of Peace Lutheran Church in Gahanna, Ohio. Go Buckeyes. After having joined the staff in 1993. Throughout his career, he's been motivated by a core conviction that God has planted in each of us the capacity to love each other, serve those in need, hope during dark times, and experience full life in the present moment. He's been a longtime member of the Renovar ministry team, and he completed his DMin in 2009. But I want to stress this new book. I mean, it is new. It is just out. Renew Your Life. I had the privilege of reading it early on, and it really opened up a new understanding of the energies of God that we all need to sustain us, whether in ministry or professional ministry or whatever. We're all in ministry. And so Kai has been a blessing to me as a person and a friend, but he also has given us a wonderful resource in this book. So thank you, Kai. Let's welcome him to the stage.
I saw George Scramstead sneak out, but I'd like to just say something quickly about that. When I got into the Renovar community about 10 years ago, George was the man. He was the man. He'd be at all the regional conferences. He'd lead all the music. But one of the beautiful things that's happening in Renovar these days and through Apprentice is that the generations are turning. And yet it's not about the form, isn't it? It's about the passion that people have to worship and honor their God. And so you heard a lot from Brian Morricon. And Brian Morricon represents, to me, one of the great hopeful pieces of what God is up to in this world, to places like Renovare, because he's been able to take that vision of the kingdom that's been planted in a couple of people and continues to find its way through many, many thousands of people and make it live in his own life. And so thank you to Brian for continuing that work. I love it. You know, I'm really grateful for Jim Smith, the Apprentice team, Peyton and Elaine, who picked me up at the airport. They showed me something about this community. They're beautiful people. You're doing awesome work here. And the decisions that they're making about who they are and the choices that they have ahead for them in the future says something a lot about what's happening here in Christian spiritual formation. So thank you for that. One of the things that was interesting about my connection with Jim and the book was that I'm a first-time solo author. And so InterVarsity Press was very gracious to me, and Cindy Bunch, especially as the editor, was very patient along the way. I had a lot of questions. I had no idea what to do with some things. And so one of the things that happened about the turn of the year this year was that she said, "Oh, and by the way, you should have somebody write the foreword for your book." And I said, "Well, who's that?" And she said, "Well, let's think of some names." And so I said, I know the perfect person. I wrote her, and I said, "I think this is the perfect person for it." And she wrote back, and she said, "Well, he's a heretic." And I said, "Well, but you know what? I'm a Lutheran, right? My identity was forged on heresy, right?" So we didn't go with him. And I said, "Well, what next?" And so Jim Smith's name came up. And then I said, "Oh, gosh, I hope he would be willing to do that." But I realized it was January and the semester was starting. And so I had one of those awkward phone calls where, do you remember the situation? Now, those of you who are from traditions where you could actually dance and go to dances, those traditions when you're in middle school, and there's that super awkward moment where you were looking across the gym floor and you really wanted someone to ask someone to dance, but you didn't know how. But you finally mustered up all the courage. And you kind of walked like this across the whole gym floor. And when you got to that person, you gave them every excuse to say no, right? Like, I know you probably don't know who I am, and you probably really don't want to dance with me. I'm sure you don't want to dance with me. But if you're interested in going out right now to dance with me, I'd be willing, right? And so you give them every excuse to not do it. And so that's what I felt like when I was calling Jim, because it was like first part of the semester, and so it's like, I know we kind of know each other a little bit, but, it's a lot of work to read books. And I went through this whole list of things, and then he said, sure. I was like, well, let's dance. That was so great. But I know it takes a lot of work, so thanks. I really appreciate that. And it's been a real gift to be a part of this community this week, or this weekend. Renovari has been a fantastic gift to me. In the acknowledgments of my book, I say this: when I got to know Renovari, I would characterize my life as one of chasing the wind. Where you're going after stuff, you don't even know what you're looking for. And what Renovari helped me to do was to be able to catch the wind. They taught me what it was like to be open to the Spirit of God and to receive it deeply into my life and into all parts of my life. That's why it's so important for me to be able to speak about the sacramental, incarnational stream today. And I want to do it, I'm doing it with this title, Is This All There Is? And I want to have a movement throughout this talk that starts with what I would describe as the pernicious pessimism of our culture. And it's embodied in this question: is this all there is? Is this all there is? And I want to be able for us to move from that place of is this all there is, to the place on the other side where we are energized by the possibility of celebrating all there is. Can we take that journey with each other? From the pessimism of is this all there is, to the possibility of celebrating all there is. So we're going to start with the pessimism. And I want to look at a couple of categories of our lives, and unfortunately the data's not good if you look culturally. So we'll start with work. Sean Achor, who wrote the book The Happiness Advantage, he was evaluating job satisfaction, had some statistics that ranged anywhere from 35 to 45% of the American workforce. Maybe it's different in the UK, but in the American workforce, 35 to 40% or 45% of the workforce is satisfied with their work. Which means that 6 out of 10 people that we experience on a day-to-day basis are dissatisfied with more than half of their waking hours. Think about that. It's right-sizing, it's downsizing, it's taking on more responsibilities, it's lack of loyalty from employer to employee, from employee back to employer. All of these things have gone into the fact that now 6 out of 10 people that we encounter every day, adult people, are absolutely wrung out by their work. 6 months ago, we started an initiative in our congregation that we're just calling It's Monday. And what we try to do is once a month, we have a seminar about the connections between Sunday and Monday, and how do we help people with work-life balance, and what it means when you feel like you're stuck, and how do you go about the process of dealing with conflict in a healthy, important way as a Christian person in your setting, whether you can say anything about that or not. And what happens, it's a little bit disappointing for me so far, because 6 months later, people are still walking in, and their eyes are absolutely vacant. And their spirits are depleted. And what are they asking? Is this all there is? Is this all there is? To a new category. Think about who we are in our bodies in this culture. Last year, $40 to $50 billion was spent on fitness products or programs. $30 billion was spent on fitness apparel. We also know the fact that 40% of the people who actually join a fitness club never go. But they look really good not going, I guess. And so we have a culture, right, that is obsessed with our body image. And we have way too many people who experience deep body shame. Because those images are so prevalent. we're so bombarded by these things over and over and over again of what we're supposed to look like. And we just can never get there. And then we get older. And it doesn't get any better, does it? Nick Page, who was a Renovar Institute graduate from the UK, wrote a book recently called The Dark Night of the Shed. And in it, he was talking about a midlife spirituality, and I love his description. He said, there was a day that I woke up, and I figured out that I could no longer grow hair on my head, but I couldn't stop it from growing out of my ears. He said, I knew at that point that I could not reverse this trend. And so in our bodies, we're asking the question, is this all there is? In our relationships, George Barna did a study last year where he documented a 10-year span. And he said over that 10-year span, the people who self-identify as lonely has doubled. So it went from 10%, or roughly 10% of the population, to 20% of the population self-identify as lonely. 1 out of 5 people that you know. And think about that in this intense age of social media connections. I think the loneliness, unfortunately, has just increased, right? Because everything is superficial. There's nothing deep about it. On the other side, if you look even more deeply into the statistics, in my lifetime, the rate of depression in the United States has increased 10 times since 1960. And the age of onset has gone from 30 to 15. People are asking the questions, is this all there is? Add to that the news we get every stinking day. When I came here, when I wrote these notes, all right, to get me here, and I typed them off, or didn't type them off, I ran them off like 3 days ago. There were 45 school shootings in the United States in 2015. As of today, there are 47 school shootings. 2 have happened this weekend. James Catford talked about 1.5 million immigrants flooding into Germany, and that's only a portion of the people leaving Syria. And we've got this political system, that seems right at this point more like a reality show than reality, With all of this that's happening in the world, what are we focused on? Trump's hair and Hillary's email. Think about that. That's the focus of our consciousness in the political season. And we're wondering, is this all there is? This is an awesome final talk, isn't it? You're going, are you kidding me? My gosh, give me some stuff to take. 2 more things that I'm going to add to that. And they're both about the church. Because the reality is people are asking the same questions about the church. Is this all there is? Is this all you got? 2 stories. 1, I play golf with my son. I play golf, I'm not a golfer, so I think you know what that means, right? But we go out, and every once in a while, it'll just be the 2 of us, and so we'll get connected up with a foursome. And what happens is almost always, about the 3rd hole, we get backed up a little bit, and so we end up having to stand there and talk to the people that we've been paired up with. And you can kind of imagine, right, where this conversation is going to go. So what happens is that finally we have a chance to say, well, hi, I'm Kai, what do you do? And they ask me back, and then I say to them, well, I'm a pastor. Everything changes. Everything changes. The guilt that they feel for all the missed putts that they've had when they just curse up a blue streak the first 2 holes, they start apologizing for it right there for me. And then subsequently, for the next 15 holes, I'm asked to pray for almost every putt that they hit. If they miss something, if they do swear, lightning bolts, they say, oh my gosh, look out for the lightning bolt. And this was my favorite. There was one point where somehow we've created this great impression that all Christians are opposed to alcohol. And so when I announced that I was a pastor, literally there was this guy who was going like this, and he went, he hid his beer behind his back, like I was going to be offended. And So then he takes it out, and I actually was offended. It was a Bud Light. I mean, why would you? I'm a Lutheran. Why would you drink a Bud Light? If you're going to drink beer, don't drink. Just go with the craft brewery, a microbrewery, something like that. But here's the deal. Think about how irrelevant that spirituality is, and how it doesn't deal with any of the questions that any of our speakers have been talking about. So there's this whole sense that people are wondering, is this all there is in the church? Because there's this completely irrelevant spirituality. On the other side, I went to a family reunion in July, and we just had one branch of our family tree. And we started with my grandfather and my grandmother. My grandfather was a professor of religion at Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota, was revered in that area. He died of cancer at 46, and so he became a legend, right? Like even bigger than that. Unfortunately, he also came from a very strict, oppressive Norwegian piety background, which meant this, is that a lot of what his kids heard was this is what the faith was all about. Don't drink, don't dance, don't smoke, don't have fun, don't. That's what faith was all about for him. Of their 5 kids, only 3 of them had anything to do with the church in their adult life. They fled. They said, forget it. Of those 2 that stayed, only one, my stream, my little branch, all right, has anything to do with the church right now. So here we are with a grandfather who was a professor of religion at Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota, and his 50 children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, out of 50 of them, maybe 20 of us have anything to do with the organized church. And what they're responding to is this oppressive morality. And people, they all wondered, is this all there is? Well, I don't want to stay there, right? But I felt like I needed to present the case because it's the world that we enter all the time. It's the people that we encounter. It's maybe even the people that are closest to us in our families. They're asking these questions. So we have to be able to articulate that. We have to be honest with that. But the joy of the incarnation stream, the sacramental stream, allows us a chance, I think, for us to be able to reframe and help people rethink what this life is all about. There was about a decade ago, I received this picture of Laughing Jesus, right? It's not the greatest piece of art, but it was really fascinating for me. It came at a time when I absolutely needed it. And what it did was help me reframe what the God of all creation is already about. It was done by a Canadian artist, and so it's been replicated many, many times over that in different areas. But I started looking at it and I'm thinking, is that possible for God to be like that? And then I went back into the stories of Jesus and I thought, well, how could it not be the case? Think about it. If we're talking about the incarnation, meaning Jesus took on human flesh, he experienced all the things in humanity that we experience, think about the people that he hung out with. He did not hang out with nice Christians. What he did was he went to the very places where nobody else wanted to go, and so he spent a lot of time with fishermen. If you're spending a lot of time with fishermen, my guess is there's a lot of jokes that are told around the table that are absolutely swearing like a blue streak. And I don't imagine Jesus sitting back going, oh, dude, guys, you got to hold off on that one. I imagine him laughing and being a part of that experience with them. Then I thought, wait a second, Jesus had a body. Jesus actually had a body, didn't he? And if he had a body and he lived, then there was probably some times when he ate the wrong things. I thought, I'd never even imagined that about Jesus, right? But the reality of the incarnation keeps pushing you in that direction. This is real. This is the stuff of life. This is the ordinary pieces of life that our God was willing to invest in so deeply that he gave his only son. Then I reimagined that whole scene of, remember when Jesus takes kids on his lap? What was that about? You see all the pictures, and Jesus is this sort of somber guy, and all these little children are jumping up on his lap. I actually remember this. I think this is probably closer to the experience. One, Karl Barth, was speaking that whole concept is of laughter is, I love this phrase, laughter is the closest thing to the grace of God. And this is how I experience it. What if Jesus was the guy who was sitting with the kid on his lap going, boom, and the kid was going, just breaking up. It brought me to a whole new sense of the joy of just ordinary living. There's a great quote in the Talmud that, we think about Judgment Day, and Judgment Day, too often it takes on this very serious tone where we're going to have to reckon with all of our sins, etc. There's a great quote in the Talmud that says this: a person will be called to account on Judgment Day for every permissible thing he might have enjoyed but didn't. Think about that. Does God want us to enjoy life? And does God want us to take these things that are so ordinary, and just because we're able to celebrate them as ordinary, they become extraordinary manifestations of what God is all about? So I want to talk about 4 different things that I think we need to be able to rethink to experience sacramental joy. And they are these: to reconnect with our bodies. We have to be able to reimagine what our work is all about. We have to reintegrate our lives with the natural world, and we have to resurrect the redemptive power of suffering. So let me start at the top. To reconnect with the body. I went through some of the statistics of how obsessed we are. But here's what happens when a people, a culture gets so passionate about one thing. Passion quickly turns to obsession. And obsession is another word for what in the Bible they talk about as idolatry. And idols, listen to this, can never be satisfied. So passion can turn into obsession. I'm not saying it's not important to work out and to work out hard, and if you're there, go for it, right? But our passions can quickly turn to obsessions. Obsessions become our idols because they drive what we think about, how we act, what we spend our money on. And idols can never ultimately be satisfied. And so we're never enough, are we? We can never get there. It's a fascinating study that was done in the South Pacific on one of the Fiji Islands, and it was done in 1999. And prior to that, the people who lived on the Fiji Islands, there was no television. And so in this culture where there was no television, their bodies were just a little bit, they were robust bodies, right? And that was just the image. That was the normal image. And so if you said to someone, hey, you look like you put on some weight, that was a compliment. Can you imagine that in our culture? You'd get slapped for something like that. So you'd go around to someone and say, hey, it looks like you put on some weight. And they'd be awesome. Yeah, I think I did, man. I had a great meal last night. If there was a critique, they'd call you someone who had skinny legs. That was a critique. And if they were really worried about you, they'd say this: gosh, you look like you're losing weight. Because they were really worried about you. 1999, television was introduced. 3 years later, they did a study of especially the high school kids and the younger people. And what they discovered for the first time was the emergence of eating disorders. And if they watched television more than 3 times a week, there was a 50% higher chance that their self-image plummeted. Think about the power of that. So what do? One, we have to recast this sort of crazy airbrushed images that we just get bombarded with. And I sense we've got to really help our people refocus on who they are as made in the image of God. Jim, what was the name of the student that was up here telling about her experience? Carissa. Yeah. One of the phrases that she used was what? I'm made in the image of God. I'm one in whom God delights and dwells. Can you imagine what that does to a person? over time is that they integrate that piece, that they are sense themselves as the image of God. They are fearfully and wonderfully made by God, just as they are for who they are right now. There's an awesome Jewish parable that says this, that what you need to do is imagine yourself walking down the road. And as you're walking down the road, you imagine like tens of thousands of angels in front of you. And as you're making your way down the road, these angels are parting the way and they're saying, make way for the image of God. Wouldn't that be awesome? Chris Hall talks a lot about being image bearers. What a critical image for us if we're going to reconnect with God. Second thing is we've got to be able to reimagine what our work is all about. My wife was working out on the ellipticals at the YMCA a couple of months ago, and she was next to a person whom we know fairly well, goes to a different church in our community. And they were talking about my son who is in seminary, and in the Lutheran church you go to college for 4 years, then you go to seminary for 4 years. And my wife was saying, why do you have to get a master's degree in 4 years? Nobody else takes 4 years to get a master's degree. Get it done in 2 years. She just was kind of complaining. It's mostly because who's paying for it, right? I mean, that's the issue. So 4 years, and we're just going. And the woman turned to her and said this, well, Patty, it's because we're going to give him a sacred trust. So he needs to be there for 4 years. And I thought to myself, there are actually people who think that about ministry? It's a sacred trust. I thought, I want to just run across the Y and hug her at that moment. But then I thought, it's just not about ordained ministry, is it? All of you have been given a sacred trust. Every single one of you. Wherever you find yourselves each day, whether it's in your home or it's in your place of work or it's in your community, wherever you find yourself, God is present there. God's already been present there, but God gets to be present there uniquely because of who you are. Can I have some people do this? If you are a marketplace person, could you stand up for me? So you're not involved in like paid ministry stuff. If you're a marketplace person, could you stand up for me? I just had a rush of hopefulness for the whole world right now. For this reason. At the beginning of our time, I really appreciated Richard Foster having pastors stand up and church leaders and get a blessing. I need a blessing a lot, right? But you know what? I want to bless all of you. Because if the structures of our world are going to change, I mean, May talked about that, if the structures of our world are going to change in business and healthcare and arts and in education, wherever you're going to find yourself, it's going to be people like you who understand that you've been given a sacred trust by God. And in those places where if you can say it or not say anything about who you are as a Jesus person, you can be that person and begin to switch how this world acts. And the kingdom of God will become real in your classrooms, in the cubicles that you inhabit, in the hallways that you walk, in the sidewalks, in the streets that you walk down every single day. That's where Christ is going to be real. So I want all of us who are still sitting here to give these people a great round of affirmation for the work. Well done. Seriously, you took a whole weekend to be here. I got paid to be here. You're here because the love of God has so compelled your life and you want to understand what it means to change the world and be kingdom people out there. You've been given a sacred trust. We need to reimagine our work in that way. Third, we have to be able to reintegrate our lives with the natural world. Grab my phone here for a second. Oh, good, I got a text message. No, I'm kidding. That's why I'm grabbing my phone. When I got here, my guides took me down to the big statue, and it's the Keeper of the Plains statue, and so people who are here in Wichita know where that is. If you aren't from Wichita, go check it out before you go. And I want to read what was on the plaque. The Keeper of the Plains stands out at the confluence of the rivers where his ancestors camped. So there's a massive statue of a Native American. And it says, with his face raised to the sky, he extends his arms in supplication to the Great Spirit. All living creatures are Indians' brothers. The Indian lives in complete accord with nature. Everything around him is holy. All Indians feel like this, and the sculpture has a way of appealing to all people with that message. Friends, it's not just a Native American message. In Genesis 2, as God created humanity, God took the dust of the earth, the Adamah, breathed into it, and it became Adam. There's an etymological connection that they were making between the creation, the human creation, and the creation from which it was made. When May talked about Leviticus 25, and in the Holiness Code, I love that whole sense that one of the deals is we also let the land have a Sabbath. There's in the scriptures it said, if you've been working the land hard for 6 years, what do you do on the seventh year? Let it go fallow. Because it's connected with the rhythms of God. Psalm 19:1 says, what the heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims God's handiwork. We have so much that we can learn by being reconnected with the natural world. Jesus, when he spoke, what did he use mostly as metaphors? The natural world. And people understood them. And I don't think, I'm just going to be honest, I don't have as much of a sense of what those mean these days, living in a suburban world that I do now, as I did when I grew up in a rural community. Because you're connected with it all the time. Brian McLaren was here a couple of years ago, right, at the Apprentice Institute. And one of the things that he gave me a great image to think about why it's critical for us to imagine ourselves part of this connection with the natural world. And he said this, when we dishonor and abuse God's creation, we dishonor our relationship with God. We need to remember, friends, that this is not a political issue. It's a biblical issue. It's not a political issue. It's a biblical issue. And what he said was this, what kind of a world do we want to bequeath to those who are downstream from us in time? Do we want to deprive our grandchildren from seeing elephants and tigers and hummingbirds in the wild? Do we want to leave them a world even less imbalanced than our world today? Is that neighborly? What he's doing is saying the command to love your neighbor as yourself has implications for how we understand our connection with the created world. Is that neighborly? The more we as Christians follow Jesus by thinking in terms of our duty to our neighbors downstream in space and time, the more we will take our stewardship of creation seriously. My wife's family has a cabin above Red Lodge, Montana. The cabin itself is at about 8,000 feet. And so the stream that runs in front of it is glacier fed. It's about 35 degrees. It is pristine water. And so that was we could use that as the trailhead for many different trails going up in the mountains. But I remember there was one time where we were maybe 4 or 5 miles away and we went down to the stream because we just wanted to sit by it and rest for a little bit. And all of a sudden I noticed a plastic bag floating down the stream. And I was so offended because someone upstream from us didn't regard what I'm going to experience downstream, and they used it as their trash can. What are we going to bequeath to our kids and our grandchildren? We have to be able to reintegrate our lives with the natural world. Final thing is here. We need to resurrect redemptive power of suffering. Friends, we got to bring suffering back. Sounds horrible, doesn't it? Oh my gosh, are you kidding me? That's all you've been talking about is suffering. We got to bring suffering back, but we've got to bring back within the context of who we are as Christ's people. Think about this. Jesus did not enter the world because all was well. God was not surprised. When Jesus went off to his times of prayers, he didn't say this, God, you can't imagine what you got me into down here. God was not surprised by the violence that was part of the human condition, by the hypocrisy, by the hatred, by the divisions that were there in the culture. God was not surprised by it, but in fact, God loved it and them and us so desperately that God wanted to be able to redeem the situation of suffering. Our faith was born because this very human person suffered the most humiliating, horrific, brutal death on the cross. And if that was it, we're not here at Friends University 2,000 years ago, 2,000 years later. There's no Apprentice Institute. But the power of God said even the most intense depth of suffering that you can imagine is not outside my capacity to redeem. And in the resurrection of Jesus, put a claim on this world and the powers of death and the powers of violence and the powers that continue to divide us, and says those ultimately will not have a hold on you. Paul talks about this in Philippians, and when he says this, he says, I want you to know Jesus, and I want you to know the power of his resurrection. And I'm saying, woo, I love that power of his resurrection. And then he goes on to say this, and sharing in his sufferings by becoming like him in his death, if somehow I can attain the resurrection from the dead. Friends, I'm a pain avoider. I wanted to stop after the first half of that sentence. But what Paul reminds us of is this: there is ultimately nothing that will separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ. Not life or death, not angels nor principalities, not heaven or earth, not height nor depth nor anything else in all of creation will ever, ever, ever separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ. And that suffering that we are experiencing right now can continue to be turned and redeemed for the sake of the glory of God. That's why this stream, for me, is so critical. And it's so critical because it's so embodied in the normal work that we do in the life of our communities. It's called sacramental because it connects with the sacraments. Now, in the Lutheran Church, we have two sacraments that we primarily experience. I know many other traditions have more than that, and some traditions, and we all think about them differently. But here in the two sacraments that we celebrate every week, first one, the Lord's Supper. What are we actually celebrating? We're celebrating that our Lord Jesus sat around a table with a person who would betray him, who would deny him, and everyone else who would flee. And he could have said, I know that you're not worthy. I know what you're thinking. I know what you're going to do. But John's gospel begins in the 13th chapter with this: having loved his own who were in the world, what did he do? He chose to love them to the end. So every time we receive the sacrament of Holy Communion, what we're doing is somehow sharing in the suffering of that night and also the redemption brought about by the resurrection after that. That's why these sacraments are so critical for us. It's a material thing that gets connected with the promise of God, and that's what makes it a sacrament. Holy baptism, same thing. What happens in holy baptism? We're drowned. That's the imagery that Paul talks about. We've been buried by death, right? This is what baptism is all about, so that a new self can arise to live with God. God will redeem our suffering. That is the ultimate hope that we have as people of God. And so we as people of God have to not be people who just run from it, deny it, put it off as much as we can, but we have to say, even within it, we have a word to speak and a hope to claim. A couple ways to just think about how we might do that. One, I think we have to help people with just the acceptance that suffering is real. And it's going to happen even to us. Life is hard sometimes. And because life is hard doesn't mean you doubt more or you have less faith. It just means sometimes that life is really hard. And so we have to help people deal with just the acceptance of the nature of that. Second, when there are those things that we need to resist, and what May was talking about those today, all those injustices, the systemic stuff, we have to resist. We as people of God, because we aren't willing to just watch the suffering happen, we have to resist those powers and work to make them different. And finally, there's also, so we accept, there's acceptance, there's resistance, and then in the end, there is a presence that we offer. There's some times where all we can do is stand next to somebody. That's all we can do. And what we're doing when we do that is we're sort of offering our broken selves to their broken world. And in the middle of that, we're receiving the broken body of Christ and hoping and praying that God will again redeem that suffering. It's interesting how often suffering and joy are used in the same sentence, isn't it? They're part of one experience. Because we can receive a joy from God because we know that suffering is not the ultimate reality. So let me do this as a way to close. I'd like you just to imagine what this joyful, sacramental, incarnational life is like. So close your eyes, if you would, and just listen to me. And I'm going to walk through categories and ask questions in the middle of that. And I want you to just imagine these places and imagine the presence of Christ being lived in you through that. So friends, is it possible for you to imagine God's Spirit infusing you and your life, even in the most ordinary parts of your day? You're eating breakfast, you're holding hands, you're dealing with conflict, you're walking into work, even in the most ordinary parts of your day. Is it possible for you to imagine God's Spirit embracing your family in times of joy, but also conflict, in your living and in your dying? Is it possible for you to imagine God's Spirit invigorating you in your workplace, wherever that is, whether it's a boardroom or a classroom, whether you work with a laptop or at a cash register? Is it possible for you to imagine God's Spirit enveloping and encouraging your neighbor, whether they are friend or stranger? Is it possible for you to imagine God's Spirit enlightening and cherishing peoples of all different races, creeds, socioeconomic classes, and other differences? Is it possible for you to imagine God's Spirit moving in the mountains and the valleys, flowing in the springs and the arid deserts? Is it possible then for you to imagine also God's Spirit urging you to care for those mountains and valleys, those springs and deserts? In other words, is it possible to be relieved of the fatiguing pessimism of our time and saying, is this all there is? And walk boldly into the energizing possibility of eternal living as you celebrate all there is. Amen.